Hello, my name is Elisa Bossingham, and I'm in the International Economics class in the MBA program at WKU. And I'm going to be talking today about the tomato dispute that's been going on really since 1960s, but there was a little side of it a long time before that. The first sign of the tomato dispute was actually seen in the 1800s. The U.S. government imposed a tariff on imported vegetables, and that included tomatoes at the time. And the U.S. government was sued due to the fact that tomatoes are considered a fruit and not a vegetable. So the Supreme Court had to rule, and they sided with the U.S. government and ruled that tomatoes were in fact a vegetable. The first side of the actual tomato dispute between U.S. and Mexico was seen in 1968 to 69 when the legislation was passed that set larger size requirements for vine-ripened tomatoes than mature green tomatoes. This reduced the supply of tomatoes that Mexico was able to export to the U.S., therefore assisting the U.S. domestic producers. Over the years, the dispute went back and forth with Florida farmers accusing Mexico of dumping, selling at lower than fair market value, and they were dumping the tomatoes into the U.S., and Mexico was trying to maintain their export in the U.S., and Florida was complaining because of Mexico dumping the tomatoes into the U.S. market. The last reported dispute in the paper that I was reading was in 2013 when the U.S. raised the minimum price for winter field tomatoes and put in a new price minimum for specialty tomatoes and tomatoes grown in greenhouses. At this time, they also divided tomatoes into 4 different groups. There was field-grown, greenhouse-grown, loose specialty, and packed specialty tomatoes. At this time, Mexico agreed to label all produced tomatoes as not for export to the USA. And this was in order to help prevent industries from buying the tomatoes in Mexico and then bringing them back to the U.S. and selling them for a price lower than the minimum price. The Political Economy of Trade Policy paper that we read in our class discussed a framework that included economic self-interest as well as a concern for the welfare of others as their motivation for political action. Based on the U.S. and Mexico tomato dispute, I see Mexico fitting into this framework pretty well. Because throughout history, Florida did everything they could to get Mexico out of the market of tomatoes in the U.S., but every single roadblock that the U.S. threw at Mexico, Mexico met it. And they were able to resolve the issues and do what they needed to do in order to stay in the market in the U.S. and sell their tomatoes. They have their self-interest in mind by continuing to fight to sell their product, but they also have concern for the welfare of others because they're willing to increase the tariff costs if it means that their workers and their farms are not losing out on money by not being able to sell in the U.S. Over the 47 years that the U.S. has implemented multiple restrictions for the trade of tomatoes from Mexico into the U.S., they first implemented size requirements of the tomatoes. They implemented a seasonal tariff that was different based on the seasons of the tomatoes. They also at one point set a quota of imported tomatoes, and anytime Mexico exceeded that quota of tomatoes into the U.S., they were charged a higher tariff. This specific restriction didn't seem to work as well, though, because between 1994 and 2003, imports actually exceeded quota greater than 40% in every single year but one. The U.S. also implemented price floors to ensure that Mexico was not selling tomatoes below fair market value. The final agreement was raising the minimum price of tomatoes as well as implementing new categories of tomatoes to apply different price minimums for each one. Although these may seem like a lot of restrictions that the U.S. placed on the Mexico tomato industry, Mexico met them every single time, and they continued to export their tomatoes into the U.S. It didn't matter what the U.S. threw at the Mexican farms or the Mexican tomato industry. They were willing to meet it and do whatever the U.S. required in order to stay in the market for the tomato production of the U.S. market. It's easy to see that the tomato market in the U.S. was important to the farms of Mexico, and so they were willing to do whatever it took. Thank you so much for your time.